Hi, I hope all of you probably know who I am. Peter Ston, I'm Editorial Director of LTT Land or Links. This is the 8th of our Friday afternoon discussions, which we began way back when the lockdown started in March. And we've explored all sorts of issues over the last 8 sessions. Today, we're looking at rail as such for the first time. It's come up a lot in the other discussions. And it seemed to me that we should be having a go at what is the best way forward for rail in local transport terms, given the difficult circumstances the rail industry is now in, and also the way in which local authorities can take a bigger role potentially in making the best of local rail capabilities. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew Forster. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, Peter. Hi, thanks very much. So the topic for today is local rail. Do we need a new business model? Very much, I think, looking in the context of COVID-19, but also the wider issues affecting the industry. We had the Williams Review, which is yet to report the associated white paper, and I think there's a bit of uncertainty as to how that is all affected now by COVID. I was just reflecting on our own coverage on how the public transport sector has been impacted by COVID-19. And I think it's fair to say most of our coverage has been looking at the bus industry, which has had its own issues. The rail industry has had this kind of 6-month support, which ends in September, but may well be renewed and continue beyond then. We did put a freedom of information request into DfT on how much this is all costing the government, the additional support, given that there's not many passengers on the trains, and I'm awaiting a response hopefully this month on that. But look, let's go to our four speakers now. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open for questions and discussion. Use the chat facility at the bottom, as Peter just suggested. First presentation I'd like to welcome is Nigel Harris, Managing Director of the Railway Consultancy. Nigel has a long career in the rail industry, working for local authorities, train operating companies, and the DfT. So he has his fingers and legs in all sorts of areas of the industry. So over to you, Nigel.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked to say a few words by way of introduction to this subject, to put it into context, really. So let's just start off. I think it's important that we realise what this is. Lots of people think the railway is about businessmen taking 200-mile journeys, but actually it isn't. I reckon there are around 1 billion journeys made on the railways that are of 10 miles or less. And this is not just regional. These are spread across basically every operator. So our office is in South London. There's plenty of local journeys in South London. On the other hand, LNER's carrying local journeys in Scotland. So big chunks of these in London, but clearly the focus also on the sort of small town and rural market. And I think really the renaissance of this started under the regional railways part of British Rail in the 1980s, where there was a comprehensive programme of opening new stations, particularly in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. That slowed a bit during and after privatisation. But as a random fact for you, relatively few people realise that a minimum of 100 of Britain's railway stations have opened in the last 20 years. And actually, for those of us of my age, 10% of Britain's stations have opened since we started work, which perhaps people don't generally realise. So the picture I've got here is Mansfield in Nottinghamshire. This is one of the early significant reopenings from Nottingham northwards. Station on a line that was never shut because it had coal trains. Building was still there, but new facilities put back in the early 90s. I think more recently, the last few years, we've seen a sort of a resurgence of interest. So Paul Salverson's going to talk in a minute about community rail. I think if we look at the main lines, we're already carrying big quantities of longer distance passengers, and the lines are quite full anyway. So this has tend to focus attention, I think, onto some of these more local rail issues. Road congestion is generally getting worse, and whether it's Greta Thunberg or anyone else, I think the environment's becoming more important. We've got a political devolution agenda, so Transport for Scotland, for Wales, Greater Manchester, and so on. And over the last 6 months or so, this Conservative government looking to rebalance the economy, I think also helpful in trying to look at railway schemes not in the Greater London area. And let's be slightly cynical, smaller schemes should be quicker to deliver. It should actually be possible to announce a scheme and deliver it in the same Parliament. Whereas I did the business case for Crossrail on behalf of London Underground in 1991, and we're still waiting. So here's an example on this. This is Kirkstall Forge in West Yorkshire, which opened a few years ago with a sort of out-of-city office development next to it as part of a development. So I think development-driven stuff, quite important. This is going on around the country. The Department of Transport has something called the New Stations Fund, which comes in around every few years, broadly to match each control period. Typically, they've got £20 million to give away, and it's spread between 4 or 5 stations where other people have managed to pay for most of it, but not all of it. And this map, which I've nicked from the Network Rail website, gives you an indication of the yellow ones, which are in progress, and the green ones, which are delivered. Except that since the map was put there, I'm pleased to tell you that Hordern in County Durham opened last month. So stuff's going on already. However, this politically became more noticeable when dear old Boris announced reversing beaching. Now, I'm aware that many civil servants have been cringing ever since about this, because replacing beaching for beaching's sake is just not what this is about. Officially, the fund is called Restoring Your Railway. £500 million has been made available, but it's important to stress that this money that is available is not just for replacing stuff. Beaching did lots of great things for the railways, some very sensible rationalisation. I mean, again, in the Mansfield area, we had a section of line where there were 3 separate railways, 50 metres apart, made no sense. On the other hand, lots of stations were shut, and we've subsequently seen significant social deprivation and exclusion. We've got new towns built up since, sites may be unavailable. So straight like for like is really not what this is about. It's a can we do something similar? Well, there were 3 rounds of applications. The June one that you may have reported recently, where all 50 were listed publicly. I can tell you that 62 sets of people applied in March, and there's another set in November if you haven't got your bid in yet. This, though, very much has to be something for local support, and the way it's been arranged is the bid itself has to be lodged through the local MP. But it's not about railway stuff. This really is about local groups of people, stakeholders, local authorities, parish councils, working out how a reopened railway station might benefit their local economy. This might be for tourism, it might be to support a new development site, it might be to give access to a group of people who otherwise can't get to jobs. It's not just the railway for the railway's sake. DfT is also very much aware that just paying consultants to do more studies isn't a great use of public money. So this is very much about trying to encourage people to work together and each chip in some contributions and top stuff up and so on. We are still doing traditional benefit cost ratios, but I think we have to acknowledge, particularly in the post-COVID world when passenger numbers clearly very much down now and will rise only slowly in the coming months, that actually there is a greater emphasis on the sort of socio-economic and political factors. We're not just going to find lots of schemes that pay for themselves and sign them off. We're going to land up with schemes which are medium BCRs, but society as a whole, and that includes you people, we deem this is kind of worth doing. So just a couple of examples to finish with, really. So the Department of Transport's now got this NREP process, which is the National Rail Enhancement Pipeline. And there are 3 sort of gate posts, or whatever they call it in that, signposts. There's an authority to design, and authority to develop, authority to deliver. And the purpose of what's currently going on is to try and push things to accelerate them through this process. So where local authorities have been really upfront already, for example, in the northeast of England, we've got Ashington Line. The Ashington Line is well through this process. And one, I suspect, would expect this scheme to be finished in the next couple of years, similarly with Portbury and Bristol. However, further back, the first round of schemes, 10 were given money for taking work further, for example, for Network Rail to undertake cost estimates. And I've mentioned a couple that we're involved with here. we developed a solution for a low-cost passing loop on the St Albans Abbey branch. This line currently has a bizarre 45-minute frequency service, which is not terribly handy. And local people have forever wanted an improvement in that. So some proper costing estimates are being done for that. And we're working in Herefordshire at Pontrydas, which is on one of the longest sections of railway in Britain, but without a station. It's 24 miles from Hereford to Abergavenny. Locally, Hereford and Abergavenny, they're far too far away to be useful. Hereford has road congestion. How do you get to and from this substantial rural area? Well, maybe the answer's with a station. And I think what encourages me about where we're at now is there's genuine potential for local people and local stakeholders to get stuff included in DFT plans. And as the Department of Transport is currently running the railway because we temporarily nationalised it, that's actually what matters going forward. So everything's quite positive with one caveat. Have we got the money available? And I'll end you there with a question mark. Is the money available?
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's a great start. Let's go to the second speaker now, Paul Salveson, rail commentator, visiting professor at the Universities of Bolton and Huddersfield, part of the rail reform group, grew up, worked through the railways in British Rail days, set up the Association of Community Rail Partnerships, worked for Northern Rail in privatisation era. So I think good credentials there. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And yeah, thanks to Nigel for setting the scene so well. So do we need a new business model for local rail? Well, my focus on local rail since being involved in the community rail movement was very much on the rural sector. Although I think it's fair to say that nowadays community rail is much, much more than rural branch lines, and there's a very strong urban agenda. But what I'm particularly interested in, and where I think there is an opportunity as well as a threat, is in the rural rail network. And I think it's a long time ago since we launched New Futures for Rural Rail at the National Railway Museum in 1992. But there were sort of two main messages there. One was that community rail partnerships were the way forward for getting a quick hit in driving up ridership on rural lines, as we then identified them. But also we should look at the experience from Switzerland, Germany, other parts of continental Europe, where different forms of local management have proved highly effective in developing the rural network. So Switzerland is the most long-standing one. So I think where we're at now, there is a real opportunity to look afresh at how our rural railways are developed. At the same time, recognising that we're already hearing some commentators saying that the knives are going to be out for the rural network once again. It's a bit like an old record that scratch. We keep hearing it every time there's a crisis. But there is going to be pressure to reduce costs. And I think what we need to do really is turn that to a positive advantage and look at how railways serving rural communities can do much more. It's not about just going back to how things were pre-COVID, where you'd have a small number of trains running along lines like the S Valley, I suppose, in North Yorkshire is a classic example. Quite a long piece of railway, even with recent improvements, it's still a very infrequent service. You could say much the same for the Cumbrian coastline and other parts of the network around the country, where we've got these very, very precious assets, infrastructure which is expensive to maintain, but massively underused by both passenger and freight. So I think that needs to change, and I think one area that we need to address is how these lines are operated. We're still using a 19th century model with a driver and a guard, even with complete with a green flag and whistle. I used to be a guard myself back in the 1970s, so I know how the job works, and I know how it could work far better, and we need to make better use of the staff that's there. It's not about taking staff away, it's about redeploying them, putting more staff on stations, having much more customer facing staff on trains. And I know there's been lots of issues with the unions. I'm a strong trade unionist, have been all my life, but change is absolutely essential if rail is going to compete and to provide an alternative. And I think the other thing, again, particularly in rural areas, we need to look at wider issues around accessibility and public transport. And at the moment, rail and bus still operate in a sort of total separation from each other. And so we're not making the best use of either by failing to properly integrate them. So really, in terms of looking at a new business model, what I've been particularly impressed by over the years has been the work that the Settle Carlisle Railway Development Company has done, where it's always been looking for new opportunities, both in terms of better use for station buildings, running different complementary businesses to the railway, for instance, running a trolley service. They recently partnered with an operator who's running 3 trains a day on the Settle Carlisle from Skipton to Appleby. And this is all about rural regeneration. It's not just about transport, and we need to get away from the idea of seeing rural rail purely in transport terms. It's key to rural regeneration. And so I'd like to see more examples like the Settle Carlisle Railway Development Company with powers to do much more than what they're already doing, to develop that sense of local enterprise, which I know Nikki has written a lot about, and we'll hear more later on this afternoon from her on that. And it's not about taking infrastructure control away from Network Rail, or necessarily taking the actual train operation away from a train operator. I think there's ways of doing that where you can have much greater devolved local management. And when Nigel was talking about railway reopenings, the big problem we have in England is who actually drives these, particularly in areas outside the metropolitan areas, because the local authorities, with the best will in the world, don't have the resources anymore. Whereas an empowered railway development company, I prefer to call it a rural development company, could actually properly resourced, involving the local authorities, the community, and also the local business sector, really start to drive some of these reopenings where the opportunities are there with the Rail Reopenings Fund. So I'll end at that and say my key message is, yes, there's a need for change. Rail has got a real opportunity now in serving rural communities, but unless we seize that opportunity, some of the knives will start to come out, I suspect, in the next 12 months, and that will be disastrous for rural England as well as Scotland and Wales, although the focus here is very much on the situation in England, where there's a gap which is currently being served to a pretty good extent, actually, in Wales and in Scotland, but we don't have that in England. There's a big problem specifically here in England, especially putting my northern nationalist hat on, in the north of England. Thank you.
Northern nationalist.
Thank you very much, Paul. Lots of thoughts there, which I'm sure we'll return to in the discussion. Third presentation, I'm going to go to Malcolm Holmes. Malcolm is the Executive Director for the West Midlands Rail Executive, and has spent a lengthy career in the rail industry and in the West Midlands itself. I think, Malcolm, you're going to explain that you also have a role at TFWM, but I'll leave you to explain that. Okay, over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Yep, I've had a long career in railways, 28 years, and like Paul, actually, I was a guard as well many years ago, and spent the last 8 years working in local government, and now lead as Executive Director of the West Midlands Rail Executive. The Rail Executive is a partnership with local authorities that brings together metropolitan district authorities for the populous West Midlands metropolitan area, together with the surrounding Shire and unitary authorities. A geography that maps logically the rail network and the travel to work area for central Birmingham. So it's a mix of urban commuting and rural railways. But as Andrew said, there's a role for TFWM for me there as well, because I'm also Director of Rail for the metropolitan area. A good example of making a sensible decision, bringing together two organisations where the roles significantly overlap. Our role falls into sort of three key areas, really. We do rail franchising, so we partnered with the Department for Transport to refranchise the local rail network a few years ago, and we have joint management responsibilities now. We hold the rail strategy for the West Midlands, and we're also involved in some capital work. We've got about £180 million worth of capital schemes underway, including 5 new railway stations. So Nigel will need to update his list of the number of new stations in a few years' time, I hope, if we get the money together, because he's absolutely right about the point about money as well. We're also upgrading a couple of others as well, about to award contract for University Station in a couple of weeks' time. Many other things that we're doing, I'm sure I'll touch on some of those in the questioning later on. COVID-19 has had a profound impact on transport, as you will all have seen. It's absolutely unprecedented, I think, in history, even more than wartime, in terms of its impact on transport demand. But it's also had a profound impact on us all as individuals. And there's been an opportunity to reflect, I think, as individuals, as society, and as a transport industry, on what opportunities there are, and what transformational change can now be enabled as part of this. There's going to be some long-term impacts, I think, and it's anybody's guess as to what they're going to be and how deep they're going to cut. But the psychological impacts that have been introduced through COVID, I think, will be quite difficult to shake off. We've spent the last 4 months telling people it's unsafe to travel on transport and not to use it. You know, it's one thing to have a one-off event like terrorist action or a rail accident that does have an impact on demand for a short period, but this has been 4 months now, and people have begun to get used to these changes. Wearing face masks on public transport is very alien, it's very odd. I've done it a couple of times now, but only a couple of times, and it feels very strange indeed. And trying to get used to drinking a cup of coffee on a train with a mask on takes some getting used to, I can tell you. Working from home will bring about significant change to our commuter market, certainly in the medium term, almost certainly I think into the longer term. I'm a good example of that. I live in Sutton Coldfield, about 20 minutes out of Birmingham. Used to commute 5 days a week into Birmingham. I'm certainly not doing that again. I hated it. So very keen not to do that in the long term. That will have an impact on commuting demand. The technology we're using now has enabled that, of course. I barely acknowledged the video conferencing technology before coronavirus. It's now my primary means of conducting business. And earlier today, I had a meeting with somebody in Scotland that would have taken months to organise, and it would have involved me travelling a very long distance, having an impact, of course, on long distance demand as well. So it's driving forward a number of these changes, I think, which were underway already, but it's most certainly accelerated them enormously. Now, significant collapse in patronage on rail, down to about 10–15% of what it used to be, and it's not recovering as fast as bus and tram in the West Midlands, and that's probably a consequence of the type of market that it attracts, certainly for commuting, with white-collar workers like me working from home. As has already been mentioned, the government stepped in very quickly with emergency measures agreements, very successfully actually, I have to say, but of course that resulted, from our perspective, in a centralisation of control. So temporarily at least, the powers that we have were wrenched back to Westminster. That's levelled out a bit over the last couple of months and is working reasonably well, but it has resulted in that centralisation and a change to the way that we've been working. Profound changes are going to come in rail, that's for sure. I mean, franchising has got to be dead. If it was dying before, it's now certainly dead. We haven't seen Williams yet. Will we ever see it? Don't know. The latest I've heard is it coming in the autumn. But in essence, much of, certainly from a franchising perspective, of what Williams was proposing has now been introduced literally overnight. Really, one of the positive effects we've seen already from COVID is the impact on operating performance. Just before the call, I looked at national PPM, and it's currently running at 96%, with all bar 2 of the operators at 95% or above for performance. That's pretty much unheard of, certainly on a weekday. And it'll be a consequence of running less trains and with less people on the network. But certainly a desire to try to keep that and to improve the quality of the product offering if we're going to encourage people to come back. So what is the outlook going to be? What do we need to draw people back to rail? Well, I think the structure's very important, and I think it's certainly the experience of having dealt with the emergency that is COVID-19 in the West Midlands is that devolution and the continued ask of devolution is ever more essential. It's been a relatively confused message with different modes being dealt with in very different ways, and difficult for us as a transport authority to try to navigate our way through that and create any sense of a cohesive transport network that is integrated. A small example of that, but that's important and indicative, is in the early days of the pandemic, we worked with operators, our own tram system, to offer free travel to NHS staff on the public transport system, but we couldn't do that on rail because the DfT wouldn't allow it, and we don't have, of course, the powers to make that happen. That's not how I don't think we should be running an integrated transport system. There's an opportunity now with the right contract, the right specification, with local accountability and local control, to begin towards creating that nirvana of an integrated transport system. We've got a bus industry that's very heavily subsidised now. We've already got our own tram system, and bringing the same in rail and making sure the levers are in the right place should allow us to create a much better and a much stronger transport system if we're given those powers than we would have had before. There's opportunity to support decarbonisation. We're in a climate emergency, our political leaders tell us, and we can use transport to help get out of that. One of the benefits the early days of the coronavirus pandemic was the cleaner air in the city centres that people really valued. I'm sure I've seen more birds this year than I've ever seen in recent years, and I can't think that isn't something to do with pollution. So there's certainly opportunity, I think, to come out of coronavirus to structure our industry in transport generally, but particularly in local rail, in order to come back stronger than we had before, to embrace technologies, and also, and I wasn't going to mention it, but Paul did, also look at productivity change, the way that the workforce in rail in particular is a very unionised workforce, and trying to encourage some change there to ensure that we're able to keep up with modern technological change and way of working. So what are the outcomes we're seeking? Well, we're seeking a better environment, of course. We're not seeking to fill the roads with cars, to give passengers confidence to use the transport network again by demonstrating that it's safe, by maintaining performance, and also ensuring the capacity is there when we need it. So there's been huge learning. We've got an opportunity that we need to seize, and I think we need to create the platform working with government in order to be able to build back better from this this seismic change for our society and industry.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. Excellent stuff. Final presentation, over to Nicola Forstdijk. Nicola has a long, lengthy background in the rail industry, though she's now at the University of York, a lecturer in management at the University of York's Management School, having completed a PhD, I think, on the knowledge base in the rail industry. She worked for the railways, regional railways northeast, I think, in the British Rail days, spent a few years in the rail industry after privatisation, then went to work for Halcro, and became a freelance consultant in 2012, where she helped on franchise bids with her marketing background. So Nicola, over to you.
Thank you. So as I see it, there are really two key issues facing local rail services now. The first relates to demand, as Malcolm's outlined, and the second to how the industry is set up to meet that. So to begin with demand, for the past few months, the government's been giving out a very strong and successful do not use public transport message, This seems to have done the trick in persuading people to avoid the use of rail. And short term, I think this issue of confidence really needs to be addressed. Malcolm's outlined as a necessity, but I'd offer a solution, perhaps in the form of a national marketing communications campaign. For maximum impact, I think individual corporate egos need to be set aside, and we need a national approach that's used to get more reach. People need to be confident that travel's safe, and they need to have a motivation to travel. That is, reasons to travel to rail-served destinations. And that really brings us to my longer term issues. So rail is a derived demand product. So people don't just buy a rail journey because they fancy travelling around on train. Well, not many people, but because they want to go somewhere. So they want to go shopping, they want to meet up with their mates, they want to go to a sporting fixture or to work and so on. And as Malcolm has already mentioned, people's habits were changing before COVID-19 struck. And COVID-19 has really accelerated some of these pre-existing trends which are impacting on rail demand. It's difficult to see how pre-COVID levels of demand will rebuild, and rail is likely to require considerable levels of public fund for some time. But I think what compounds this is the fact the existing system of delivering rail services via franchises, or the pre-COVID system, is widely recognised as not being fit for purpose. One of the reasons for that, which seems to be less widely acknowledged, is that rail services in any one area are not actually self-contained, so they're part of much wider systems. So in particular, they're part of the national rail network, and they're also part of the local or regional transport networks. And our current models of planning and delivery, and in England particularly, really don't manage these very well. There's a golden opportunity now to design and do things differently. So there's potential for a more integrated approach to the planning and delivery of rail services. This is going to require a new knowledge base of how to run an integrated rail system covering both track and train. Innovation, and that's innovation around cost efficiencies as much as it is around technical innovation. It's about innovation in delivery, as well as innovation in new products and new approaches. Innovation requires generalists who understand how system components come together to deliver new things. So understanding rail operations and the business of rail are key success factors in developing new infrastructure and new technologies. The knowledge base of the industry has been eroded as a result of dogma that holds that specialization and competition are the cheapest ways of delivering things. They're not always. In the long run, they can prove more expensive. And as a side, it's been really good to see in Edinburgh the announcement that tram and buses are no longer going to be running competition with each other. So, you know, as Malcolm was saying, sometimes it does not make sense to put public transport modes in competition with each other. So my solution that I can put on the table are threefold. None of them are to do with structural change. And my reason for that is because changing the structure itself is not a magic wand that's going to fix everything. So without other things being in place, just changing the structure is potentially going to make things a lot worse. So the first thing I think we need to think about is actually the knowledge required to run integrated systems. So we can do that through developing industry-wide training, industry-wide career paths. It's not necessarily about formal training, it's about opportunities for people to gain rounded experience and knowledge. Research shows that such knowledge can't be taught in a classroom, it has to come from experience. It requires collective will to make this happen, and it requires some funding, but it's a relatively cheap solution. It's been tried before. Network Rail's track and train scheme that they ran a few years ago is a really good model for this. And there are demonstrable benefits, but schemes need to be sustained. Secondly, I think we need to build a culture that facilitates innovation and entrepreneurship. These were the original benefits that were sought from rail privatisation. Stakeholders, train, infrastructure operators all need to be aligned, not in conflict and not in hard contractual relationships. This knowledge needs to be able to flow really freely and really widely, and people and organisations need to be able to try new ways of doing things. I'm not going to get into a discussion of transaction costs here, but I'm sure many of the people on this discussion will understand that the creation of multiple interfaces in the rail industry and indeed the wider public transport industry has led to inefficiencies. Removing these interface problems requires trust, long-term relationships, mutual understanding and shared objectives. Those interface issues, of course, are also the reason why, when left to a market, a rail system will be vertically integrated, track and train will be together. So this kind of the trust, long-term relationships, mutual understanding comes from a clear and shared vision of what success looks like, and from allowing teams of people to work with each other over time. So at a small level, the station development and the infrastructure development schemes that Nigel was talking about at the beginning will fit are small examples of how that is beginning to work in practice. So local services could then potentially be developed through true partnership, multiplayer teams to be responsible for delivering and developing short and long-term rail business plans to operate developed rail services in their area. And in an ideal world, this could encompass all transport modes, but I'm a bit worried about being too ambitious at once. The rail plans would need to be integrated into a single industry-wide plan, which suggests we need some form of oversight at a national level, but that needs to support and be light touch, not dictate. Breaking from the franchise model in this way will allow rail to flex and be combined with other modes to meet local transport needs. And I think finally, delivering this model requires leadership at a number of different levels. I believe there's a huge opportunity here for individuals who can make change happen in the public sphere, public entrepreneurs, if you like, who can take the lead in developing sustainable local rail services, but that needs to begin by developing the knowledge base and aligning stakeholders. So what's really heartened me throughout all this discussion so far is all of us have said we're facing difficult situations, but born from that is tremendous opportunity. And I really think it's up to everyone, each of us and the industry to actually seize this opportunity and to try and do something with it.
Nicola, thank you ever so much. That was a great overview of how to get back. I've actually got one question for you, which I won't put you straight. Well, I'll raise it now.
Okay.
Because, but I don't. We'll go to other discussion first, and then come back to it, give you a bit of time to think. But one thing I'd be interested in thinking about and hearing about is today the government has, I think, announced that it's removing the instruction not to use public transport, which is obviously a welcome move. But what, with your marketing expertise, what would you say should be? How should we try and drive up patronage again? What are the messages? What are the mechanisms? Fair deals, whatever. It'd be interesting to hear from you if you have any thoughts on that. Perhaps we can come back to you in a few minutes. There's lots of issues which we've heard there, and it's really just a matter of organising them in the discussion that's going to follow. Please use the chat facility if you've got questions. I mean, I can see some questions to ask each of the presenters. I'm going to go to Malcolm first, if I may. Malcolm, you were talking about how the railways are currently being run in the West Midlands. Can you just give me, I'm not at all clear on how the department is approaching service levels between franchises. I mean, is the department got a one-size-fits-all policy towards what services are being provided and how many services across the country, across franchises? Or is it very much, is your impression it's very much on a case-by-case basis? Can you say something about that? And also what role WMRE has, if anything, in saying what service levels should be at the moment?
Yeah, so it's been done on a franchise by franchise basis, and the original basis for it was to do two things really. One was to create a timetable that was deliverable in terms of the staff resource available, and in the early days of the COVID-19 crisis, there was a lot of concern about the ability for train operators to have sufficient operational staff to run the service, but also for Network Rail to have, particularly on rural routes, to have sufficient staff to be able to open signal boxes and to maintain the railway. Now that was a problem in the early days in terms of train crew for train operators, hence the significant change in the number of trains that operated. There's been a gradual process of bringing that back, but it's been done largely on a franchise by franchise basis with the DfT, with a stepped process, number of changes to timetables, with the next coming in September, the most recent being a couple of weeks ago, to bring back service frequency and of course importantly capacity, and particularly in order to meet social distancing requirements. Our role actually has been relatively significant, particularly in terms of the franchise that we manage with the DFT, the West Midlands Trains franchise that provides the majority of our services. And in addition to that, we also have spearheaded and led the creation of what we call the West Midlands Ground Rail Collaboration, which brings together all the train operators with Network Rail and other bodies as well, including Transport Focus, University of Birmingham, Rail Freight Group, and so on, in a collaborative alliance that seeks to create for passengers one cohesive network for the West Midlands. So we've established through that a coordination group for COVID-19 that's been successful in sharing information and data, but also to some extent coordinating what the customer outputs are. Although I wouldn't like to suggest that's actually led specifically to what the service provision is. It has certainly had some influence, and we've been able to influence in particular areas where there's been gaps in service and so on to rectify them.
So what level of service are you currently at in the West Midlands?
It's running at about 85-ish, 80-85%. Some operators are running the full service. So Avanti, for example, are running, certainly on the London leg, they're running all of their services.
Oh, interesting. And patronage?
Patronage is running at about 15%, so still very low. It's gradually rising. Yesterday, New Street had the highest passenger numbers it's had since lockdown, but it's still a long way from what we'd expect in a pre-COVID world.
Does the Department for Transport give you any indication as to A, what's going to happen beyond September, and B, how long they can sustain the additional funding?
We are working with them on what follows in September, what follows on from the Emergency Measures Agreement, and as you'd expect, work is actively being done to develop that. So it's still in the relatively early days, so it's not entirely clear yet. But I think what is clear and pretty obvious really is that with passenger numbers being what they are, it wouldn't be sustainable. I certainly don't think it would be sustainable to go back to franchise agreements as they previously were, because the franchisees would become insolvent very quickly. There just isn't the passenger numbers there. There wouldn't be the revenue if revenue risk moved back to the operators. So there's going to have to be some kind of stepped process to get back to a commercially run railway.
Right. So because I'm right in thinking that your franchise, what is it called, West Midlands franchise?
The franchise West Midlands Trains, which operates 2 business units, and that came about because of our involvement and the need for local control. So one business unit is called London North Western, and that operates services the south end of the West Coast Main Line and some of the longer distance services. And then it's West Midlands Railway, which is a brand that we own. It's part of our West Midlands network of transport brands as part of our integrated transport system that operates the local and regional services in the West Midlands.
And the operator of that takes, before COVID-19, they took the revenue risk. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, they did.
Okay. And I just can't quite figure out in my head. You're saying that you can't go back to the old franchise system because it wouldn't be the operator wouldn't be able to survive with the revenue risk. But the opposite of that is we go to a system where the government takes the revenue risk, and surely we don't know the answer to this, I guess, but the government might want. I can't see how the government can sustain the revenue risk of fares, which I think fare revenues on the railways are £10 billion a year ordinarily. And I appreciate we're going to go back above 15% where we currently are, but we're potentially talking maybe, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 billion a year additional money the government will have to provide to maintain services.
Yep, there is a lot of money, but ultimately, of course, the government takes the risk on this anyway. So even in a commercial franchise, it's a contract with government. The operator is incentivized to minimise costs to an extent, to manage their costs, but crucially to grow revenue, which minimises their subsidy, or it creates a premium that's then paid back to government. So with the drop-off that we've experienced in passenger numbers, the government really has to step in order to keep essential services going. The only way that they could minimise their cost exposure, well, 2 ways really. One is to get passengers back to using trains again, or to cut services and reduce the cost. But doing that is very, very difficult, of course, and you can't do it that quickly either.
Interesting. Interesting.
But there's a fundamental question here, of course, is where revenue risk sits and where it sits in the long term. And where Williams was already heading was where we would like to see happen anyway, which is revenue risk moving away from the private sector and ending up with in the public sector. Part of our feedback to Williams at the beginning of his work was that it really needs an approach that's horses for courses. Taking a one-size-fits-all approach to franchising, or indeed devolution for that matter, doesn't work, because what may work for an operator like East Coast, for example, probably a bad example given how many times that franchise has failed, which makes a lot of money and delivers a surplus, compared with a local network like that of the West Midlands, which makes a very significant loss and will always require public subsidy of some level. It's odd to think that they can both be operated in the same way. So for local services such as ours, I would always advocate revenue risk sitting with the local body rather than a private operator who can focus on getting the operation right rather than having to focus on revenue, which is always going to be relatively low.
Right.
And needs the right level of specification, and with revenue risk being held by government, it needs a decent specification.
Okay, very interesting. We might come back to that if people want to delve into that in more detail. I'm just probably going to go. Nicola, I'm going to come back to you in a second. I'm just going to warm you up, as it were, with a little news snippet that links West Midlands with perhaps the marketing effort to get people back on rail. I was reading in a report by Transport for West Midlands this week that they're introducing new ticketing for the Metro Light Rail network in response to COVID-19 and the recognition that people aren't going to want to use it travel every day. So the ticketing range consists of new 3-day and 4-day tickets providing unlimited travel for the consecutive period of days. In addition, the range includes a new Flex and Save ticket, which provides 10 days of unlimited travel to be used at the customer's convenience. Once the first day is activated, the remaining days can be used any time over 6 months. So look, big discussion on rail has been season tickets, etc., whether we need new ticketing, etc. I don't know whether this is taking us down the right line or the wrong line, Nicola, but over to you.
And actually, it's quite a neat segue, because I think when I teach marketing, I find a lot of people think marketing is about the advertising that you put out. And if you're going to make marketing work for you properly, in fact, it's everything. It's how many train services do you run to meet the demand that's out there? Where do they go to and from? What price do people pay? I should say my first job on British Rail was a product manager for Rail Rovers, which is exactly the same kind of ticket you're talking about, but it was for leisure travel, not business travel. So it's how you're going to price it, then how you're going to communicate it. I think one of the big needs at the moment is for a national communication campaign that gives people confidence. So if I was RDG, I'd be looking at something that was around, first of all, what measures we're taking on major interchanges, what measures we're taking on stations to keep you safe, and what measures we're making on trains to keep you safe. And alongside that, I'd have the motivational stuff about how good it is to travel by train, how it's better, now you've been traveling around car park for a while, you realise you can't read your book, listen to me, do whatever while you're driving. So I'd do those two things. I don't think they're all. So I'd add that informational and that motivational, and remind people, which people are probably confused about where trains are running and when they're running at the moment. And it never does people any harm to remind people what's happening, and that it's back up and running, and where they can get to and from, and the key destinations that are being served. And of course, up here in the north, it comes on the back of a period of long poor performance as well. So you've got that extra confidence building to get people really confident in using rail.
Do you think the need to wear a face mask is a good thing or a bad thing?
So I'm slightly ambivalent about this. I've travelled a fair bit in China, particularly, and I think very much it's difficult for British culture to understand why wearing face masks is important, and we see that as strange. But it's been striking in this particular epidemic that the countries that have dealt with it before, we've dealt with SARS, have got a culture of wearing masks to protect other people. And I think this disease is going to be around for a while, and we're going to have to get on with it, really. And I think the more we see people wearing them, the more it will become accepted as part of what you do.
Right. Yeah, I'm still at that psychological barrier stage of getting on public transport because of it, I find. Malcolm kind of suggested he's not a regular rail traveller at the moment, he suggested. If anyone wants to kind of chip in with ideas on this kind of area, what we need to do to restore confidence in rail or advance tickets. Yeah, Martin Higginson. Martin, you've said something about this. Do you want to come in on it? Or I can read out your statement. Martin Higginson says, if integrated seamless public transport travel is to become the norm, is there a future for restricted train-specific fares and constrained use advance tickets?
I can just add to that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. My perception for a while, well before COVID, is that advance tickets restricting you to a particular train defeat so many of the objectives of running a good quality train service, frequent trains, the flexibility to go somewhere and come back when you're ready to come, rather than when somebody tells you you've got to come back. And I just don't feel that the model of the train specific tickets, so that you don't stay longer somewhere when you're enjoying yourself because you'll miss the train, or if your meeting or your visit finishes early or it starts to rain, you can't come home earlier. I think these are things that we would be well rid of. I know everybody wants to get a bargain, but I think there are better ways of doing it.
Okay. Jamie Sant, you've got a question. I prefer you to say it, actually, just so I understand it. Understand it correctly. Jamie, do you want to come in? Jamie. Okay. I'm going to just ask the devolution, the devolution point.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry.
Jamie, hi. Come in now. Come in now. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Sorry about that. I didn't realise I was on mute.
No worries.
Yeah, thank you for your presentations. I found them really interesting and valid across the industry nationally. I just wondered before, when you mentioned about obviously the government advised not to use public transport, do you think that's something that we should tackle locally to start marketing public transport as safe to use? Or do you think that's something that the government should come in and tell people that it's now safe to use public transport? I'm just thinking on a local level until the government take action, really.
Okay. Well, Malcolm, that sounds a good question for you.
I thought it was for me.
Nearly made the same mistake and left it on mute. Yes, and of course, the announcement today from Boris Johnson that transport can be used again for other than essential journeys. So we are beginning now on that journey. I think actually there's a case for both. I think there needs to be a national message, because the messages around coronavirus have been national almost entirely since the beginning of the crisis. So I think that there is that need, and I know that the rail industry have been planning a campaign around this. But there is also a need for us to do something locally, and through the Grand Rail collaboration I mentioned earlier, we've been already considering about how we run a regional campaign. So rather than operator specific, we run one that's regional, about getting people back to using rail. And public transport generally, because it is about integrated transport and making all modes appealing, not just rail. So I think the answer is that there's a place for both.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Paul, you painted a potentially rosy picture, but you also painted a potentially gloomy picture. And I guess I'm still wondering which way this is all going to go. You for rural lines, particularly, you were focused on, and you were saying maybe kind of Settle and Carlisle Development Company sort of model could be a way. I just wonder whether the knives coming out they might come out quicker than any creative solutions arise, and what your message would therefore be to people, and who your message is aimed at.
Well, I think there are real opportunities, positive opportunities at the moment. And I think we need to be very, very careful to avoid talking ourselves into a sort of mindset where cuts and even closures become inevitable. So I think the great strength of the community rail movement back in the mid-1990s, at a time when there was a lot of talk about another beaching, was to say, well, look, there is a positive alternative to closing lines where you actually get them performing better, doing a better job for the communities that they serve. And arguably, we're in a similar situation to that at the moment. So it is all about agency. If people are actually standing up and saying, well, look, we need our railways, but at the same time, we need them to do better. We need them to be more integral to the rural economy, as well as the local economy in urban areas as well. But I think that there is a specific rural issue there, and it's not going to be solved by local authorities on their own. It's not going to be solved by community rail partnerships on their own, which don't have the resources. But using some of that experience that we've already got out there, look at what bodies like the Settle Carlisle Railway Development Company have done. So we're not talking about taking over running trains. We're not talking about taking on major heavy maintenance, but taking over some of the responsibilities that are currently done by both Network Rail and the TOC. For instance, like station maintenance, repairing line-side fences and what have you, providing catering on trains, but looking at wider opportunities for linking in to the bus network, so you've got one rural transport network, which includes promoting cycling as well, through bike hire at stations. A whole range of things could be done which make a positive difference. And it's something that the DFT, which has been very supportive of community rail, in all fairness, and they put money into community rail, now is a chance to actually say, well, we could do so much more based on the experience of the last 30 years.
Okay, I'm going to come to Nigel just shortly, but I just wanted to pull just one point. I'm not sure if all viewers will be aware, you touched on an initiative which is actually taking place on the Settle and Carlisle line, I think at weekends at the moment, of this, which surprised me, because I couldn't fathom the logic of it, but maybe you can provide some local knowledge on it. There's, I think on a Saturday, there's a train operator is running additional services between Skipton and Settle, or Skipton and Appleby? Okay.
Appleby. And it's during the week as well. They're running 3 trains a day. I think it's every weekday.
So right, so we've got what? What's the logic of it?
The logic is, and it's something that the development company, as far as I can see, has been instrumental in brokering between the operator and the railway, both Network Rail and Northern. So it doesn't aim to compete with Northern. It's about providing a high quality experience with catering and so on. So it's not trying to duplicate what Northern is already doing in terms of providing a transport service to get to Carlisle. It's providing a tourist experience, and tourism is so key to rural areas now. And so I think they're really all credit to them. They've managed to find the paths to do it. I think the thing now is to get people actually using these services, which will be a great benefit to Appleby. In the old days, back in the 80s, a lot of the steam specials used to stop at Appleby, and the economic impact of 400 or so people having 2 hours to spend in Appleby was absolutely enormous. That no longer happens now because it isn't possible operational to stop a train there. But by terminating it and taking it off the main line, people can spend time, spend money. So there's a big economic benefit. Let's get away from just seeing this as being about railways and the sort of nuts and bolts and types of trade. It is actually about reviving the economy in places like this.
So who's funding it?
Well, I get the impression it's being done on a commercial basis. I don't know whether there's any public funding coming into it. Could be wrong, but that's certainly my impression.
Okay. Nigel, you know, your presentation, a lot of focus on new stations, new line reopenings, and yet we've got this tension, haven't we, between that kind of rosy future and a current system where there aren't many passengers around. And I think you said that we have to perhaps go beyond the benefit cost ratio on patronage and showing the kind of wider context to it. But you must be a bit concerned that the government is going to get cold feet along halfway along the line and say, well, if there aren't the passengers, then there isn't the benefits.
Maybe. But I think what's become much more recognised in the last few years is this greater link between the railway and the economy of the areas it serves, which is something we kind of forgot 20 and 30 years ago. So I think people realise that, you know, we look at, I don't know, the Borders Railway and the impact that's had on regenerating the borders and making it not just some agricultural bywater, but somewhere that, you know. So I think that linkage is quite important. It's understood a bit more. But I think that's part of a wider issue, which I'd just like to raise a couple of points about the variability of demand. We've kind of made an assumption here that because the average at the moment might be 18% or whatever the answer is, that it's actually 18%. And if we look around the railway, even with the rural lines, I mean, in the projects we've been involved in, the railway consultancy once got on a train to do some surveys, and there were actually no passengers on a train at all. Now that's not great. On the other hand, a couple of years ago, I went on a train on the Esk Valley line, and there were 340 people in a two-car train leaving Middlesbrough because of a local event. And that, I think, is why we have to be slightly careful about how we look forward. I mean, yes, we do need to market to get people back, but don't forget, we tend to run quite short trains in Britain. If you run a short train and have the kind of current restrictions on loading proportions that we were allowed, we could very easily get overwhelmed. And so, you know, from my perspective, sitting in the south of London where we have people going to Brighton, maybe people in the north of England don't realise that Brighton typically has 7 trains an hour, and on summer Saturdays you can occasionally queue just to get on them. And I'm not talking about weekday peaks. So even if only half those people turn up, we can have a problem. So you're right. There is an issue. The government might get cold feet about things. But I think this recognition that it's part of a wider recognition that you get the government gets, that actually either you can let everyone be unemployed, or actually it's better for everybody if you kind of support these intermediate things and keep as much of the country going as possible. If that means keeping some trains running so people can still get to work, and then spend some money in the local town, that may be less bad than the alternative. But yeah, someone mentioned before, it's a bit horses for courses. I think we just have to be slightly careful about lumping all these quote local railways in the same basket, really.
How you deal with a lot of local authorities. Tell us about local authority expertise and interest in railways.
Well, I can't show you the details, but I have shared with the Department of Transport some slides I prepared showing the variability in local authorities between the strongly pro-rail, incredibly helpful, and the rather less so, should we say. I mean, some positively anti-rail, others just not having the resources to be able to respond in any meaningful way. And that's why, you know, again, we look at the initiatives on the Settle and Carlisle line. Maybe you need a local group which isn't the local authority, but the local authority supports, because we don't have the critical mass to get that kind of going. Now, Malcolm's blessed with a core of competent staff who can go and do lots of stuff. But some of our smaller local authorities who perhaps only have a population of a couple of 100,000 may only have one public transport officer, and they spend 95% of the time doing buses, and that doesn't leave much for doing any railway stuff. So I am reasonably optimistic, but just cautious of the money, and hope we can grow demand at a kind of sensible level that reduces the subsidy quick enough to keep the Treasury happy without challenging our train operators too much about being impossible.
John Carr, you had you've made a point on the chat about local authorities and also subnational transport bodies. Do you just want to say what you've said?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that local authorities have is, of course, that they can bring suggestions to the party, but the majority of them can't bring rail scale financing. That's only ever really been possible in the metropolitan areas, although to their credit, I think counties such as Lancashire have managed to finance new stations and good things seem to be going on in the southwest in Devon and Cornwall. But we've got Transport for the North, and we've got counterparts in other regions. To what extent could they be responsible for specifying the network and service level patterns that their regions need? I know TfN has got a plan, but how is it going to implement it?
I'm wondering whether, without looking at anyone else putting their hands up, Malcolm, can I come to you on that? We've got TFWM, we've got the West Midlands Rail Executive, we've got Midlands Connect. How does it all fit together? And you know, if we go further devolution, is it clear?
And we've also got, as John says, we've got local authorities as well, county authorities, and there is, as Nigel was saying, that there is a huge difference between those who are very interested and those that aren't. I'm lucky in the West Midlands that even with those that are the least interested, they are engaged and do care and do see the value of rail to their society, their communities, and to their economy, and want to see it develop. And then at the other extreme, I've got authorities such as Warwickshire, who have been responsible for opening many of the stations that Nigel mentioned earlier, the likes of Coleshill Parkway, Warwick Parkway, Stratford Parkway, and others. And Worcestershire as well, of course, have just recently opened a station and invested significantly in Kidderminster Station. And so, I mean, in answer to your question, I think all of those bodies have got a role to play, but at different levels, and can also step in and help where there isn't the resource or the opportunity for a local authority, for example, to intervene and meet a requirement or an opportunity. Midlands Connect focuses specifically around the big strategy stuff on a Midlands pan-regional level, so East to West Midlands connectivity. And they've got an important role to play in lobbying central government and gaining funds for investment in the likes of Midlands Rail Hub, for lobbying for HS2 and so on. As a rail executive, we own the rail investment strategy for the West Midlands. That takes it down a level in terms of granularity and regional context, and that specifies the service levels, the capacity that we think we're going to need, or should I say thought we were going to need when we published it a year and a half ago. It's no doubt changed now, and we are going to be doing some work to bring that up to date. But that starts to talk about where there might be opportunity for local stations, and it might be that we take on the development work for an investment in a new local station or other bit of infrastructure rather than a local authority, or it could be a local authority. Transport for West Midlands, being part of the West Midlands Combined Authority, have money access to cash. I don't as West Midlands Rail Executive, but through the Combined Authority we do, and it's through the Combined Authority that our capital schemes are largely funded, or in part funded, in truth. And this is often the case with many third-party rail projects, is that funding comes from a variety of sources. The University Station, for example, for the rebuild of that, I've got about 8 funding streams coming together in a very complicated and painful manner in order to meet the funding requirement for that station. So a rather waffly response there to actually say very little, except that all organisations have got a role, and as a subnational or a type of subnational body, we've got a role in supporting those local authorities. I think the final thing I'd say is that the good thing about organisations like Midlands Connect, like the West Midlands Rail Executive, is that we are both. What we certainly share, and we share a lot of things, but what we certainly share is that we are partnership organisations. So we have in our membership a lot of local authorities, and for a local authority like Herefordshire that Nigel mentioned earlier, or Telford and Wrekin, that are very small, don't have a huge amount of resource for rail, by being part of our club, which doesn't cost them very much, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And we've got a good reputation with government, and we're able to have a reasonable amount of clout with central government, and working closely with organisations like Midlands Connect to help them get their agendas done. So we have a role in fighting on their behalf, lobbying on their behalf, and supporting.
Thank you. But Neil Chadwick, Neil, I can't see you on the video. Are you on the video? No, you're not on. Oh, you are now. Neil, you've just summarised what I've been thinking in a much better, more articulate way than I could have put. Do you want to just have a few words?
Oh, I doubt that, Andrew. You're a journalist.
You're an analyst.
I think there's two things that strike me as important. One is, what will the new normal level of rail demand be, and the second one is, how long will it take to get there? And with recession, which we are in, and unemployment, which who knows where it will get to, it's inevitable that even if we could all go back to how we behaved in February, pre-COVID, there will be a reduction in rail demand, simply because there'll be fewer people employed, so fewer people travelling for work, and fewer people employed means there'll be those people are less economically active, so less travel for leisure. That suggests to me that the new normal level of demand will be below the pre-COVID levels, and I think, as sort of Malcolm was indicating in his little talk, I think that essentially means, or is Nigel, can't quite remember, but essentially means that the franchises are broken in terms of their financial situation, because they're all let on growth essentially, and they can't cope with a reduction in level of demand of 10%, 5%, and probably even 2%. Will cause long-term problems for them. So ultimately, it comes down to the government, because the only people who can pump the money in to keep the railway running when the demand is below what the costs are is the government. They're the only people who have that money. The local transport authorities don't have it. You know, government can go down to Threadneedle Street and borrow whatever they like. West Midlands Combined Authority can't do that. So I think it comes down to the attitude of the government. You know, how long are they prepared to do that for? And when does it come to the situation when they say, enough is enough? And we're looking at rail demand, and we don't see it coming back in such a way that the service, we can continue to support it in the way it is, and we want to start cutting the service. And it's not to say that, you know, that's going to be uniform across the board. There will be areas of where growth is stronger, and there'll be areas where growth is weaker. But basically, in some respects, it doesn't really matter what we think. It really matters what the Treasury thinks, and the Chancellor thinks.
Does anyone want to comment on what Neil's just put there?
I'm very happy to comment on it, if only just to agree with everything you just said. I think your analysis of it is absolutely spot on. There's a lot, of course, that we don't yet know. We don't know where the demand is going to come back, if it comes back. You know, is long distance travel going to take a particular hit? Because people like me that used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to Great Minster House to have a meeting with the DfT for 45 minutes and then come back to Birmingham, are we going to do that anymore? Oh my bugger! You know, I'm going to do that on a video conference. So that's one trip every couple of weeks that won't happen anymore. As well as the psychological impacts that I mentioned earlier. What's going to be the long-term impact on people's willingness to be stuffed into a train along with many other people in very close proximity, having had the experience of COVID and social distancing? If you walk down the street now, people step out into the road, risking getting run over a car in order to give you the space you need to go past. So are we going to be happy into the long term being stuffed onto a train with other people? That has impacts on capacity. So we might carry less people, but the society may require us to have to retain the same length of trains or even longer trains in order to provide a comfortable space for travelling. We simply don't know at the moment. And then it comes down to that question of whether the government are willing to pay, because ultimately that's what it will be. There will be a finite amount of revenue, and actually it's a red herring as to whether, I think, as to whether revenue risk sits with government or it sits with operators. The reality is there is a finite amount of money that will come in through passengers, and the rest will have to be picked up by government, or there'll need to be some cost cutting. There are some opportunities though for rebalancing our rail service. The performance that we've delivered across much of the country, particularly the north of England and in the West Midlands in recent years, has been atrocious and not something that we should be proud of as an industry. But what we are seeing now is exceptionally good performance, having adjusted the number of trains that operate. So I think there's something that we should salvage from that. Do we ought to question whether we need to go back to running all the trains that we ran, whether we need to be running, for example, trains across Birmingham that were introduced as part of the franchise for lots of good reasons, not least generating revenue as well as providing new journey opportunities, but atrocious for performance. Should we be doing that again? I think I'm fairly clear on what I think the answer should be. But that is a discussion that needs to be had once we know more.
That's interesting. We've heard that similar for Greater Manchester through the Castlefield corridor. And also,
I agree with Malcolm about it's Churchill said, "Never waste a good crisis." So, what are the opportunities for us in rail? And one of them would be a lot of the capacity, both that we operate now and a lot of the plans and programs that we come forward for increasing that capacity are driven by what happens between 8 AM and 9 AM. And if we can get into a situation where there's an opportunity that because of the changed behaviour, because of social distancing, and we can get people into new habits, we can start to spread that demand from 7 till 10. We could operate the railway incredibly more efficiently than we do now.
Yeah, can I just say, I think that makes an impact on costs too. There are train operators in the south of England who can make a profit on everything except the height of the peak, where they have to get in special trains. We have train sets that do one single train journey a day. Actually, not being able, needing to run them would be great. So Malcolm has pointed out the performance would go up, but we'd save that train set and some staff. So before we go, this is terrible, we're going to lose lots of money. Actually, if more people travelled off peak and slightly fewer in the peak, we might be terribly happy.
I think that's absolutely right. If I can just come back on that, and Andrew Pritchard, Andrew's made a number of comments in the chat. Almost all of them I totally agree with, and his most recent one is about encouraging more people to travel with comfortable seats aligned with the windows and so on. And I think actually that there's an opportunity here to redefine what rail travel is. Now, the commute previously, for myself included, was essentially a distressed purchase and not something we really want to do. But actually, in a new white-collar world where we work from home a lot, then surely the commute has much more flexibility about it. Quality becomes more important, and the enjoyment of that journey. If I'm only commuting 2 days a week, then I might have more flexibility about when I travel. I shall want a better quality product than I got before. I'll be looking forward to it. I did go into Birmingham for a meeting last Thursday, and I was looking forward to it for about 4 days. It was a very exciting thing to be done. Mix it in with some social activity at the end of the day, or some shopping or whatever, and actually it become a very different experience. And we might need to adjust the product that we've got today in order to meet that. So I think Andrew's absolutely right, and that applies both to long distance travel, but also to commuting. But it also changes the commercial dynamics of it.
So one of the points I was trying to make is we need an entrepreneurial railway to do that. And we need entrepreneurial transport authorities as well. So this isn't about predict and provide, I don't think. It's about really understanding rail as a business. It's about, there seems to be an implicit assumption that rail is efficient in its use of money. I don't think it is. Paul was talking about some of the savings that could be made. And I think it needs some sort of system that is more flexible, more entrepreneurial, which probably suggests it's not run centrally from Westminster, which enables us to take a view of what do we really need to keep our local economies going, and what is the most efficient way of providing that. And I totally agree with the comments coming out, this one here from John, but part of that, what is the most efficient way of doing that, is rail may not always be the most efficient way. So I think if we consider rail and transport generally, and we consider it in terms of what's the best way to do this, that is entrepreneurial and that is business led. And that is what can really protect our local economies, which after all is what rail is surely there to do.
Could I just come into that point in relation to what John was saying in relation to the Conwy Valley? And I think we should really learn from the experience of the 1960s when BR closed down a lot of the lines across Wales, particularly in North Wales, which if they'd have survived, they'd have done very well. I think there's particular problems in terms of the infrastructure on the Conwy Valley line. But if you look at it, this is a line which carries a lot of tourists. If you took the trains off and just put a bus on, well, yeah, you get local people would use a bus. You won't get many tourists using it. and that's been shown time after time after time. But maybe we should be looking at the Conwy Valley in a different way. It connects in to one of the most successful tourist railways in Europe, the Festiniog, at Blinder Festiniog. Would it make sense for the Festiniog Railway to actually run the Conwy Valley line instead of Transport for Wales, run it to TfW specification, but apply some of that entrepreneurial drive that we see from the Festiniog very consistently and linked into the tourism industry to really transform the fortunes of the Conwy Valley line, rather than this sort of rather half-hearted, infrequent service that, as John says, is quite often washed away anyhow. But make sure that there is provision that when, and this applies to other local lines as well, we need that protection of Big Daddy Network Rail, that when things do go catastrophically wrong, that they will step in and see it as being part of a UK-wide rail network and put it to right. But the actual running of it should be run locally.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that, Paul, but the amounts that have been poured into that line, you know, 3 or 4 million every other year, it seems, and the last one, which may be more permanent, considerably more than that. The reason that Festiniog would be able to do a better job on it, in my view, is that Festiniog would not be carrying the costs of a train operator and Network Rail to the same extent. And yes, you might be right, but there's another entrepreneurial approach. It's a very attractive corridor, but to get to most things that are attractive in it, you actually need to use the road at some point. So wouldn't tourist coach services, which did other things in the winter, in the off season, wouldn't tourist coach services be able to fill the gap that you're saying there is for tourist demand and still feed the Festiniog?
So basically, I think tourists don't like being stuck on a bus, and it's it's a philosophy of despair, I think, you know, and it's old thinking, John, with all due respect, and I've got great respect for your professionalism. What we're not, and I would be lying down in front of the tanks, metaphorically speaking, if there was any attempt to close railways down for whatever reason. We should be getting beyond that thinking. And I think one point which we've not talked about, I noticed Jerry Swift mentioned it in the chat, you know, where does climate change fit into all this? And I think rail has got a huge opportunity there to be at the forefront, looking at alternative forms of traction. We need to move away from diesel. We need to look at what's being done with operators like Viva Rail, experimenting with battery technology, which I understand is going to be tried out on the Conwy Valley line. Just ring a bell. So there's opportunities there. It's not about looking at rail on its own, and this is where I strongly agree with John. We need to be much better at linking rail in with bus and getting the best out of both. But that's not about cutting rail services and put rail replacement bus services that might last a year or two, as they did in the 60s and 70s, and then that's it, you're on your own. I think as things stand in terms of people's psychology, people will transfer to a train. Trying to get people out of the car onto a bus is much more difficult. And there's ways you can do that, and there's some good operators, as we all know, that have been successful in doing that. But really offering that seamless alternative where, you know, if you get to Blinder Festiniog, not just the Festiniog railway train there, but also a bus that can take you to Bala, Trasfynydd, and various other.
I'm going to bring this discussion.
Sorry,
I'm going to bring the discussion about the Conwy Valley line to a close. We have got more about the Conwy Valley and bus services in it in the next issue of LTT for both of you to enjoy reading. What about opportunities to cut costs on the railways? Yeah, I'm going to say Peter Stonham's raised the technology point. He started right at the beginning. I'm just going to read out what Peter said, but then I'm going to say a little bit broader, but then anyone can chip in. So Peter Stonham's point was, do we need to look at lower cost secondary rail technology, both track and train, not necessarily Parry people mover, but something lighter and less demanding on infrastructure. And I would just broaden that out to make two observations. Have we not reduced the costs as far as we can on a lot of railways? Because we've been talking about doing so for years, and if we haven't done so, then I'm puzzled as to why. And B, I would also cover staffing. I mean, it's the layman or the popular reader of the tabloid will read the salaries of train drivers and think, you know, how on earth can we, you know, I mean, it's 60,000–70,000 pounds to be a train driver, I believe. Is there room for revisiting that with an almighty battle with the unions? So look, technology, staffing, who wants to come in on those areas?
I'm happy to start off. I think they're sort of interrelated. So the initial one about staffing is one market that privatisation did create very successfully was a market in trained labour. So, and that's not really talked about, but the scenario we have at the moment is where the taxpayer generally pays to train drivers who then go and work for non-subsidised operators and create profit for elsewhere. So I'd love to see something written about that sometime, because you don't see that particular discussion aired. And there's also, just as there is in drivers, there is also a labour market in very professional rail managers, which is why you will see the same names come round, and you will see certain, because skills are scarce, basically. So the railway skills take a long time to learn. They can only be learned through experience, and they're rare. So we have a market that creates costs. Where you had a nationalised British Rail, they can control that because you don't have, but you know, the individuals can't play off the labour market. But privatisation created a labour market, and that's put labour costs up. So the economists can comment on how you might change those dynamics and what you would need to do that. Technology, yes, has a potential to. The interesting about technology, there's a really fascinating academic called, can't remember her Christian name, Zuboff, who she wrote in the 80s and is still writing about technology and about how good technology actually creates more jobs than it saves. It creates high value jobs. So we need to think about how we can use technology best in the railway. But I come back to my point that to use technology well, you need to understand the system that it's working within. You need to understand its effect on the system as a whole. You need to understand the components of the system in order to design technology. And again, one of the things that I wonder whether we're doing at the moment is there's very few people who actually see the railway now in the round. There's a few people who've come up through British Rail who have that view. And of course our equipment suppliers, so people like Alstom, people who are making both signalling and trains, they can see both sides. But for many people working in the system, they can only see their own little part of it, and that actually makes things very inefficient. And that's where cost comes in. You don't know whether somebody's offering you a good cost if you don't actually understand what that represents. And so I think with improving knowledge base in the railway, sorting out some of these interface issues that I was sorting out, we could actually take quite a bit of cost out.
Okay, interesting. Who else wants to come in on that?
Can I just chip in a bit? Jerry Swift.
Please do.
Yeah, this business about cheaper trains and trams being the answer, having had a long and painful association with tram train while I was working in the industry, it is, in my view, a bit of a myth that these are cheap. They're not. They're pretty much as expensive as a train. And the issue, I think, is really the one that Nikki's highlighted. It is a limited market. It's a limited market, unfortunately, on occasions being driven by people who don't entirely understand it. And it's that tends to drive cost rather than some view that there's a cheap train out there to be had. We remember the trains, the cheap trains, we loved them. They were called Pacers. And, you know, that was the way you built cheap trains. That's not, I would suggest, the product we need to be offering to people in the modern railway. It's absolutely essential that we're offering them a quality product, and there may well be opportunities to reduce the price of trains, but I suspect they're actually quite limited.
Malcolm, you've got experience of using Parry people movers, and I appreciate there are other forms of, you know, there's a very light rail train under development in the West Midlands now by different promoters. and it has been talked about for, I think, 1 or 2 possible routes in the West Midlands. What's your own thoughts on these kind of lightweight trains?
Yeah, mixed. I should probably declare I'm actually a director of the Black Country, on behalf of TFWM, the Black Country Innovation and Manufacturing Organisation, who are setting up the Dudley VLR Innovation Centre. But I think Jerry is absolutely right in many respects. I mean, the Parry People Mover that works on the Stourbridge Town branch is great for that application. It goes up and down 6 times an hour, has a fantastic performance, does very well, people love it, and it does a great job. But they are very limited in application. There are undoubtedly other applications in the country for that sort of approach, but they aren't volume. There aren't the economies of scale that you would expect. So you can get a train very cheaply from Bombardier, relatively speaking, because they churn out hundreds and hundreds of the things, and the design work's already done. Whereas the bespoke applications for what theoretically or conceptually ought to be cheap, as Jerry was, I think, absolutely rightly saying, just aren't there. You're not going to sell enough of them in order to provide them cheaply enough. And the pace has succeeded partly because there were so many of them built. So you've got the economies of scale, as well as it being combined with it being a low spec product. But I think where there are opportunities, although I think they're probably limited in the West Midlands, is the use, and there was the point that that was made in the chat earlier, was it's not just about the rail vehicle, of course, it's also about the infrastructure that goes with it. And we have got in the habit in the UK rail industry of, even for sidings, of using brand new rail and brand new sleepers, which I guess theoretically, of course, have a longer life. Whereas historically, that would have been, used rail from the main line that would be then used for a secondary purpose. And I think there's probably an opportunity to review some of that. I'm not an engineer, and there might well be some good reasons why we don't do that. But I can't think that there aren't opportunities to reduce our costs in terms of infrastructure. And there's also, going back to rolling stock, there's also ought to be an industry look at what we're throwing away. New train, because of the way the franchising market has been over the last few years, new trains have been very cheap. Cheaper often, particularly when combined with quality points in franchise bids, than retaining existing perfectly serviceable stock that's 25, 30 years old. And we're throwing away and scrapping, and there's much more of this to come in the next couple of years, perfectly serviceable rolling stock and replacing with new, whereas we could save money collectively as an industry by not doing that. The other big area of cost saving, as I did allude to earlier, is the tricky area of employee relations and staff. And Nicola was absolutely right by saying, in the course of privatisation, for all its bad points and good points, one of the things that it has done is to drive up staff costs enormously. Whilst operating practices aren't that different to when Paul was a guard in the 1970s. In fact, the job is still very much recognisable today, even though the technology has moved on enormously. So there is a big opportunity in that space, but it does require some balls, and it's going to require quite some protracted fight with the unions, because they're strong and they're not going to give in very easily, because it's existential for them.
The Parry People Mover drivers and staff, they're on a lower rates, aren't they?
They are, yes. Yeah, they are. They're operated by another, they're subcontracted into West Midlands Trains, so they do operate on completely separate terms and conditions.
Interesting. Well, I was going to go to John Yellowlees at one point and ask how Scotland is doing things, because I know Scotland has different approaches and often does things in a way that many people in England think are better, but I don't know if he's still there. And I don't know if he's coming in. His name is there, but his picture's gone.
Hello.
Oh, John.
I've been trying to...
How's Scotland coping with this, and how's it different?
So the Scottish Government is pursuing its own course, as you know, on the so-called Road to Recovery, which sees ScotRail restore a virtually normal service on the 3rd of August, except for some trains late at night which won't run because, of course, some train crew are no longer available, they're shielding, whereas, and there's been no driver training during all this period, people retire and so on. So the offer returns to normal. The public presentation of it, that remains to be seen. I mean, I've been trying to send you a message to regret that there's no train anymore to Barnard Castle, because there would have been the opportunity for Dominic Cummings to catch it so as to prove his faith in rail again. We are led by people who have not shown much leadership in the context of public transport. Even this week, the Scottish Cabinet Secretary has been warning that social distancing will make travel very difficult. Yet if you go on Lothian buses, there is no social distancing. There is nothing whatsoever on Lothian buses any more than there is on EasyJet. The railway industry really has behaved very softly, very accommodatingly towards its paymaster government, and I fear we'll pay the price. I entirely endorse what you have said, that the knives will come before the good ideas.
Interesting. Wow. Right.
And the Scottish position is that, at least nominally, so the HST is coming in, Kintore station due to open in the autumn, the Jacobite is running again, all that sort of thing. Construction projects on railway stations have resumed. So it looks good, but I do not see the leadership or the role models to encourage people now very scared of catching trains to resume doing so.
Yes. Yes. Interesting. Okay. Well, look, we've gone to 3:30 and actually beyond. It's been a great discussion. I've loved it. I hope it's been interesting to everyone here. And summing up, well, I think the comments John's just made about and Neil made in a different way about how long the government's prepared to fund and whether knives will come out before good ideas. It did just strike me through discussion with Malcolm for a time was maybe for local rail, the government will see a way out of this as devolution, but without enough funding. That would, pass the problem to local government, and it wouldn't perhaps be the first time that they've realised that's a way of solving a problem for themselves, if not solving the problem per se. But I'm sure there'll be more. Well, we'll have a write-up of this in the magazine, because I think it's been really, really great. And I'm going to thank the speakers and thank everyone for attending, and pass back to Peter Stonham.
Yeah. Hello. Great. Andrew, well done. Like you, I've really enjoyed it. And I think we covered a lot of ground, which interrelates in many ways, but not many people have the responsibility for interrelating it, And I was particularly, I think what you're doing, Malcolm, is quite special in the West Midlands, because with those links you've got to the local authorities and with that overlap with Transport for West Midlands, I think you're exploring something that other people aren't doing in the same way, at least. And it would be nice if we could have more agencies like yours covering other parts of the country, I think. I don't know whether that's on the horizon, but I think it might dovetail with Andrew's point, and that we probably ought to be ready for the government saying, look, you sort this out yourselves, guys, because they've got a lot on their plate, and this is a hot potato they're probably better off not having. So I hope you're ready, Malcolm. And I think you'll need a congestion charge or something to pay for it. Do you know what I mean? You've got to come up with another way of raising money that isn't part of the existing landscape. I don't know what it is, but I think there was some carbon tax, or there's some congestion charge, or there's something new that we haven't even thought about yet that might make this possible. So I'd like to thank the speakers as well. I usually go on a bit longer than Andrew does, but Andrew's gone on longer than he normally does. So that we've probably had a pretty good nearly hour and 3/4 on this, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And I'm particularly pleased with the variety of contributions from our panel, which brought dimensions together which don't always appear on the same discussion. So thanks for that. And we will write it up in the magazine. And further discussion is always welcome, either in the magazine or if people want to contribute, again, get in touch with me and we'll arrange other discussions online. Thanks, everyone.